Well, now we have the privilege of turning to the Lord's Word and asking Him to speak into our hearts and our lives. In our reading this week, we read the story of the beginning time frame of the Exodus, which was the plagues that God sent upon Egypt. And Israel had been enslaved to Egypt now for some 400 years. They had been abused by the power of the Pharaoh, and they were driven to build cities and these great monuments that stood to declare the power of the Egyptians and the Egyptian gods or idols, and they had done this for centuries. Some of those monuments are still, the ruins of those are still present even to this day, that you can see the labor that the Israelites had put in under their Egyptian slavery. So God used the blessing of Moses' obedience that we talked about last week, and then the curses that we're talking about today, the plagues, to bring His people out of bondage in Egypt. Now, most of the time we read through this part of the story, and we don't even give it a whole lot of thought. I mean, it's about God's people that lived a long time ago in a place far away. And we don't think that these plagues that happened some 4,500 years ago have a whole lot to do with us today. But I want you to understand that this morning that the plagues of Egypt are not just a story of how God acted once upon a time. These plagues carry a powerful message for God's people today. They carry both a strong message of promise and a strong message of warning. Now, before we get into that, I want to go through and just highlight what these plagues were. We're just going to list them for you before we go back through and talk about the real significance at that time and then even today of what those plagues are about. So if you did your reading this week in chapter 7, starting at verse 14, it was the plague of blood. And so the waters of the Nile turned to blood. Not only the main river, but all of its offshoots began to turn to blood. The second was the plague of frogs. Frogs were everywhere. And then there was the plague of gnats. Gnats covered the land like sand, the scripture says. Then there was the plague of flies. Flies covered the land, and these are annoying and get in everything, get in your food, and they're just nasty. They brought disease and sickness and maggots everywhere that they were. And then there was the plague of livestock. So all the horses and donkeys, camels, cattle, sheep, goats, all of them became sick, and many of them died. Then the next was the plague of boils. These big, open, pussy wounds that broke out on both people and the livestock. Then there was the plague of hail. Hail beat down on the crops that were ready to be harvested and damaged their income in this way and their food source. And then came the plague of locusts. And locusts came and destroyed whatever crops were left over after that devastating hail. And of course, locusts were a farmer's worst nightmare anyways. And then they have a plague of them coming in to wreak havoc on what was already a really dire situation. And then came the plague of darkness. This thick darkness covered the land and all over Egypt except for the land of Goshen where the Israelites lived. And if all of that wasn't enough, then the last of the plagues was the plague of the firstborn. And during this plague, all the firstborn sons died at midnight, including the firstborn of the cattle. Except for those families who followed the Passover instructions of smearing the blood on the door frames and the doorposts of their houses. And we're going to zero into that part of the story next week. In next week's message, we're going to look at the powerful message behind Passover. But so all of throughout Egypt, they were grieving and mourning the loss of their firstborns of the family. And think about this. All of this took place within the course of somewhere about a year. Having just come through a year like 2020, we got pretty lucky, didn't we? Compared to that, think of the devastation that they were in here. So those are the 10 plagues. And when we examine the plagues and their effects, there are a few things that are really pretty obvious when we look at this. First of all, it's obvious that God will do whatever it takes. I want you to get this. God will do whatever it takes to set His people free. God will do whatever it takes to bring his people back to himself. He's willing to bless, but he's also willing to send curses. And it's also obvious that these plagues were God's curse upon the Egyptians. And even though it was God's curse upon the Egyptians, it was felt by the people of God as well. They were God's judgment and discipline for the Egyptians, keeping God's people bound up in slavery and keeping them from being obedient to him and doing what it was that he had called and purposed for his people to do. And it's also obvious that these plagues were devastating, not only for their land, but for all of their people. The plagues contaminated their water supply. It wiped out their crops. It left their animals either dead or very sick. So their agriculture was destroyed. Their finances were destroyed. Their economy and income was destroyed. Their livelihoods destroyed. And with this coming of the final plague, the firstborn that would die, the families were left completely crumbled and grieving. They were literally left in ruins. But that's not even where the significance of these plagues stops. In my studies on this throughout this past week, I dug a little further into the Egyptian side and perspective and response and view of all of this. So we're looking at the Egyptian history and culture, and what I found was that each of these 10 plagues were also a direct attack on a major Egyptian god or idol as well. So not only was their economy and their livelihood and their land and their livestock and their future crumbling around them, everything that they had come to depend upon, but the gods that they would call out to for help, the gods that they would call out to for provision and intervention, they were all brought to their knees as well, left in ruins, revealed for what they really were. Nothing. Revealed for what they really were. Fakes. Let me show you a little bit of what we're talking about here. So the water turned to blood was God's judgment upon Hapi, the god of the Nile. You see, Egypt worshiped the Nile god as their source of life and source of sustenance, since it was the waters of the Nile that brought water to the crops and gave them water that was necessary for drinking and cleaning and bathing. And the waters of the Nile turning to blood was a devastating effect, because now that life-giving water carried nothing but the stench of death, rotting blood. And then the frogs were God's judgment upon Hecht. Hecht was the frog-headed goddess that represented the resurrection of the dead for the dead of Egypt. So for them to see a log with a bunch of frogs on it, that was considered good luck. That was considered to be a blessing to the Egyptians, because not only were these frogs a symbol of life after death, but the frogs would also, of course, eat the flies that often troubled the land. But God turned this, what they normally saw as a blessing, into a huge curse by just overrunning the land with frogs. The plagues of the flies and the plagues of the gnats were judgments upon Keper, the god who kept the beetles and flies and insects under control. So God's plague was to prove to Egypt that he had the power over even idols. He had the power over idols to control the population of the flies, to control the population of the gnats that brought disease into the land. So he's saying that you may pray to your idols about keeping all of this under control, but I can bring them to you, and I can also be the one to take them away. The sickness upon the livestock was God's judgment against Apis, the sacred bull of Egypt. And this is where they went for prayers of confession and forgiveness. And so this was God's way of letting Egypt know that the blood of bulls was not sufficient to cleanse them of their sin and to make them right with the gods. And he showed them that their animal gods were completely powerless. The plague of boils, those oozing sores, was God's judgment against the Egyptian god of Imhotep, which was the physician god, and Thoth, the god of magic and healing. And what they found was that no medicine could be offered up to take away this pain and this suffering, and there was no magic strong enough to remove God's wrath. It was only the God of Israel that brought it at his command and that made it go away at his command. And then there was the plague of hail. And that was a direct attack against Nut, the Egyptian sky goddess. You see, God sent this hailstorm and lightning upon the land, and everyone or everything that was left out was killed and wounded and destroyed in this. The crops that were ready for harvest, the hail beat it down and destroyed it. And this was to show that the God of Israel was not only the God of the earth, but he's the God of the sky as well. And so then there was the plague of locusts, which was directed against Seth, the god of the crops. You see, the Egyptians' crops were devastated by the hail that had just come through, but some of the crops that weren't ready to harvest quite yet began to rejuvenize and sprout once again. And so the people were praying to Seth and saying, see, he's coming through and he will provide for our needs in the midst of this devastation. But through this plague of locusts, God sent them in to destroy even the crops that they were seeing Seth was providing, in their opinion. The plague of darkness was God's judgment upon Ra, the Egyptian sun god. They knew that all of life depended upon the heat and the light of the sun to make things grow and to make things healthy. So through this plague of darkness, God was proving to the Egyptians that he was the God of all creation. You can worship the sun god, but the God of creation created even that they worshiped and depended upon. And then finally was the judgment against the firstborn of Egypt. And this was a judgment against Pharaoh himself, the bloodline to the throne of Egypt. And this was an impact across Egypt, of course, people losing their firstborn, and we'll put more spotlight upon this one next week. But the whole land was grieving. But you have to think that Pharaoh, he hadn't been protected from all these other things, but it didn't affect him nearly as much as it affected the local farmers and those that were affected their livelihood. He had some great wealth and servants to provide for his needs. But this one struck home. This one, even he lost his firstborn. You see, Pharaoh was considered a god among the Egyptians. And by cutting off his bloodline, the firstborn of his family, the God of heaven and earth was judging him as unholy, incomplete, that he is not enough. And so his reign would come to an end. The throne of Egypt would be empty, for no man could be God. So again, not only was their economy and their livelihood and their land and their livestock and their future all crumbling around them, but now one by one, from the Egyptians' mindset, the gods that they called out to for help and intervention, they were all brought down to ruins as well. So just think about this. Like a sharpshooter, God picked off their gods one at a time through these plagues. So as I was looking at this and digging in a little bit from that Egyptian mindset and seeing the response that I hadn't really noticed there for many years, I thought, well, that's pretty interesting stuff to me. I mean, that's pretty interesting to know that God knew exactly what he was doing. He knew exactly what he was doing, not only to bring devastation among the Egyptians, but to bring down their belief system as well. And yet in the middle of all of that, I couldn't help but to think, we've got all this information, and I can't help to think, but so what? I mean, here we have all of this information, but what does all of this have to do with you and me right here and right now? I mean, what message does all of that send to us even today? And it's really very simple. You see, just as the Egyptians kept the people of God bound from doing what God wanted them to do, keeping them from being the people that God had created them to be, keeping them from doing the things that God had created them to do, just as real, just as oppressive, sin is keeping God's people in bondage today. Sin is keeping God's people from being the people that He's created us to be and doing the things that He's created us to do. In the same way, God brought curses upon the Egyptians to bring down the Egyptian idols. In the same way, God will bring judgment upon those things that we allow to become idols in our life. It's a different time, different culture, different kinds of idols. Same jealous God. So make no mistake about it, God didn't tolerate idols among the Egyptians, and He won't tolerate it among His people today. So I have to ask you here, what is it that's keeping you from breaking free from Satan's bondage in your own life? What is it that's keeping you from living a life that's completely surrendered, sold out to God? What is it that's keeping you from worshiping and serving and giving and being a productive member of the body of Christ, being on mission with His church? What is it? Who is it that you've placed on some kind of pedestal on your life that is taking priority over God and become more important to you than being in service and obedience to Him? Because, the dangers of the idols that we as a church have become comfortable keeping in our lives and homes. I wonder how many Christians today struggle with worshiping the sun god, not even realizing it. So they find themselves out on the beaches or the lakes or the campgrounds or out on the boat instead of gathering in God's house to give worship and praise to the one who gives all the blessing. I wonder how many Christians struggle with worshiping the gods of recreation and hobbies. So they find themselves on golf courses and parks and sporting events instead of turning and setting the boundaries on our Sunday mornings and keeping God in His rightful place and worshiping Him. I wonder how many Christians struggle with worshiping the gods of property. So they find themselves on Sunday morning washing their cars and mowing the grass and working in the yard and the garden instead of serving the one who's the giver of it all. I wonder how many Christians struggle with worshiping the gods of sleep and rest. And so they find themselves sleeping in and lounging around the house on Sunday morning instead of going into God's house where He promises to give our soul the rest that we so desire. I wonder how many Christians are worshiping the God of family today. So they place the wishes and the wants and the desires of their spouse and their children above obedience to what it is that God is calling them to do. I wonder how many Christians are worshiping the gods of money and possessions. And so they find themselves saving and investing and buying and doing all that they can instead of finding a way to see what God would do, to see how God would provide, how God would bless if we became the funnels of His blessing that He's called us to be. So you see, it may be a different time, and it surely is compared to the time that we read here in Egypt. It may be different circumstances as well, but so many of God's people are still being held in bondage today, as sure as they were back in the land of Egypt. We're still kept from experiencing God's will and His blessings and Him working in us and through us because we settle for the temporary good that come from worshiping our idols. So just as the Israelites had to break free of the bondage that was in their life in order to enter into the promised land, to enjoy the promises that God had ahead of them, we too have got to break free of the bondage of our idols. We've got to break free of the bondage that we've been wrapped up in if we ever expect to experience the great promises of God's blessing and favor and mission that He has placed upon us. That's why Jesus said in Matthew chapter 7, verse 21, He said, "No, not everyone who says to me, 'Lord, Lord.'" In other words, not all who enter into the church and sing the songs and say the right words. Not everyone who says to me, "Lord, Lord," will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only he who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. Because the truth of the matter is that one day you need to understand that Christ will return. I know it's been talked about generation after generation, but so was his birth, and it happened. And so we need to understand that one day Christ will return. And when he does, he's made it very clear that he's going to come back and he's going to take with him his bride, the church. People who have been washed in the blood of the Lamb, who have actively been waiting and watching and living in obedience and expecting and working toward and preparing for him. And this is a clear call from God's Word that we have got to be very careful where we place our priorities. We've got to be very careful where we place the commitments of our life and even our worship, how we spend our time and our energy. And you may step back from all of this and say, aren't you going a little bit too far, preacher? I mean, really, aren't you taking this a bit far to say that God's curses will be upon those things that we make a higher priority than him, that become our idols? God isn't in the business of cursing. God's in the business of blessing, right? Are you sure about that? I want to show you a couple of scriptures. One comes from Proverbs chapter 3, verse 33. The Lord, what's it say? The Lord curses, the Lord's curses is on the house of the wicked, but he blesses the home of the righteous. Now, on the surface, we want to read that and say, yeah, well, I can go for that. I mean, he curses the wicked, right? People out there, people that are doing some pretty rotten stuff, people that deserve to be punished. You know what wickedness really is? Wicked are those who are not doing right in the eyes of God. Wicked are those who are choosing to do wrong in the eyes of God. There are a lot of wicked people that go to church every week. People who are not doing what is right in the eyes of God. People who are continuing to deliberately do what they know is wrong in the eyes of God. The Lord's curses is upon the house of the wicked, but he blesses the home of the righteous. The righteous are those who are doing what's right in the eyes of God, to the best of their understanding, to the best of their ability. And so he lays before us both a blessing and a curse. And the choice is ours through the life that we live and the choices that we make and the priorities that we set. Here's another one that comes from Deuteronomy chapter 11. See, I am setting before you today a blessing and a curse. The blessing, if you obey the commands of the Lord your God that I am giving you today. The curse, if you disobey the commands of the Lord your God and turn from the way that I command you today by following other gods which you have not known. So make no mistake about it, God's desire really is to bless his people. That's his heart. That's his desire. But God's curses will always be upon the people and things that are keeping us from living in his blessings. Those things that become the idols in our life. So think about that. You could actually be bringing curses upon yourself unintentionally. You could actually be bringing curses upon those people and things that you allow to take priority over God in your life. Because God will do whatever it takes to set his people free. He sees more than this world and this life and these priorities. He will do whatever it takes to set his people free and to bring you back to himself. So if we allow our children and our spouse to come before God in our obedience to Him, don't be surprised if you find that your marriage is falling apart and you can't understand one another within your household, and things are constantly on the rocks. If we allow our jobs to come before God, don't be surprised when that job disappears. Or don't be surprised when it simply doesn't meet the needs of our life and our heart, and our heart, the heartache of that job isn't even worth the money that we get. If we allow money to come before God, or we're not being good stewards of what He's given us, don't be surprised when that money is never enough to pay the bills, regardless of how much you work or how much you make. So no matter what, no matter who we place between us and serving the Lord in full obedience, God has a way of bringing curses or a plague that will destroy the power of that idol in our lives. Unless we repent. Unless we make a decision to put God first. Before God sees fit that His only step in order to redeem us, in order to secure our future and our eternity, is to unleash His curses upon you and your idols. So the best way that you can possibly love and protect your family and your children, your spouse and your job and your financial security is to make sure that God is your number one commitment, not them. Because the choice is yours. Either we will choose to put God first in our life, or we shouldn't be surprised when the plagues and the curses of God are unleashed. Because God will do whatever it takes to set His people free. So the question today is this: how long are we going to test God in this? As individuals, how long are we going to test God in this? As a nation, as a world, how long are we going to test God in this? How long will we continue to serve our idols? How long will we do our things our own way and set our own priorities in total disregard of what God has been clearly calling for us to do? How long will we allow sin to reside in our life that we know separates us from God's will and direction? How long will we allow sin to reside in our life, expecting that God's just going to continue to overlook it? You see, God saw what was happening in Egypt, and He cried out. He finally cried out through Moses, and He said, "Let my people go." And then came the plagues. Because God would do whatever it took to set His people free, to bring them back to Himself. And you know, God sees what's happening in our world today. He sees what's happening in your life. He sees what's happening in your circumstances. And He's crying out today through myself and preachers all across the globe. He's crying out to the people of God, "Set my people free." Why? Because God will do whatever it takes to set His people free. God will do whatever it takes to bring His people back to Himself. So today I want you to be aware. There's a strong message and a strong warning for us. Because God lays before each of us a blessing and a curse. And through your decisions, through your life, through your commitments, through your actions and your words, He says the choice is all yours. Would you stand with me? With your heads bowed just for a moment. You know, I'm afraid that many, many Christians, and I'm afraid that our country is in an eerie time of waiting. I mean, God has been so gracious. And He's being so gracious. God is being so patient. But the truth of the matter is that we will turn back to God. Either we'll turn back to God, or we should expect to experience the plagues, the curses and the discipline of God. Because He simply loves us too much to sit back and do nothing. And where do we start? Where do we start? On behalf of our homes and our marriages, where do we start? On behalf of our country and our world, let us start with us. God wants to save and redeem this lost world, but He wants to do it one person at a time. Let us start with us. Confessing, repenting, changing our ways, changing our priorities, surrendering to His lordship, worshiping Him, making Him the number one priority of our life. No one else, nothing else. Seeking after Him, nothing more, nothing less, nothing else. For the sake of our children, for the sake of our country and our marriages, for the sake of our future, for the sake of your own eternity. Let's make the decision to put God first in your life again. And if you'll do that today, God has given us a wonderful promise in His Word. Jesus said, "Seek first His kingdom and His righteousness, and all these other things will be given to you as well." So let's seek Him right now together, saying, "Lord, I give you my life. I give you my idols. Lord, I have things in my life that I didn't even realize were idols. But they've changed my priorities. They're dominating my time. They've dominated my money. So I give you my idols. I give you my family. I give you my problems and the fears of my heart. Lord, I give you myself. I am yours. I am all yours." Folks, we're going to close with this song that I hope you'll make it your testimony and your bold prayer. The song of the blessing. We want God to bless us and our families and our nation. And it starts by the men and women of God saying, "So I surrender myself to you," nothing held back. There is no idol in my life. You are number one. And Lord, I ask that you would pour out your blessings upon me and my family and the generations that follow us. If that's your prayer today, I want you to sing this song with your heart, with passion. Maybe that you'd raise a hand when it comes to that verse, that you would pour your blessings, Lord, upon the generations that follow us. We want your blessings, God, not your curses. Make us worthy of it. Make our lives cry out for it. Let's let that be our prayer today.